Welcome to Vetted Conversations, coming to you from our 2026 Flag Day Convening in Washington, D.C. This is our live events series where we bring veterans, military family members, and community leaders together for the conversations that actually move the needle on civic engagement and patriotic participation. We're your veteran and military family member hosts, bringing you the conversations that matter. So let's get into it.
Our Service to Service Fellows program is a program that we do in conjunction with the Volker Alliance. We have some reps from the Volker Alliance. And what we're trying to do is create a pipeline for veterans and military-connected folks who are transitioning out of their service and don't necessarily want to fall into the MBA pipeline that is so prevalent, even sometimes the federal government pipeline, the federal defense contract pipeline. We know that there's a population of folks who not only would find such a sense of purpose when they're serving in the state and local government, but also are going to benefit state and local government. So today we have a panel of folks who have served at varying levels at the county, at the state, and the federal level. I'll introduce our panelists. Mr. Leroy Garcia is a partner at Perry Jacobson. He leads the firm's Colorado government relations effort. His career in public service spans local government to the Colorado State Senate, where he served as Senate President, and most recently the Biden administration, where he worked at the Pentagon and the USDA, shaping national policy and strategic initiatives. And Mr. Leroy here is a Marine Corps veteran, so welcome. Heba Abdelaal is a director at the Dion Company, and she is the spouse of an active duty Air Force service member. She has served in senior advisory roles supporting members of the Arkansas and Colorado congressional delegations on defense authorization and appropriations priorities that shape military missions and federal investments. At the Dion Company, she uses her expertise to support priorities of defense industry corporations, and she also supports the Invictus Games Foundation, which is relevant because tonight we'll be talking about how sports unites America. And so welcome, Heba. And then we have Supervisor Michael Turner of the Loudoun. He's the vice chair of the Loudoun County Board of Supervisors. He also chairs the National and Virginia Association of Counties Committees on Energy, Environment, and Land Use. And he is a retired Air Force colonel, and he went to one of my rival schools, the United States Air Force Academy, but that is okay. I will have a little Go Navy, beat Air Force for you, and welcome. So on the last panel, we talked a lot about different challenges election administrators face. They are many and varied. When we're serving in public office, there are obviously many different challenges that these folks have faced that are public. I want to start by asking each of you, how did your military service sort of influence both why you wanted to get into public service and then sort of shape how you served in that capacity to many different folks of many different political persuasions? And I'll start with Leroy.
Okay. First off, thank you for allowing me to be part of this wonderful panel. My military service, I was a reservist, and so Marine Corps reservist, but spent a good fair portion of that reserve contract out of 6 years, almost 7 years total. A good 3 years of that on active duty, of course, from 2001 to 2007. And so I share that perspective because, you know, going in as a contract reservist, I was in college, was initially a 3531, a motor vehicle operator, and got reassigned in 2003 to go to Military Affairs School. So I spent the rest of my time doing search and reconnaissance missions for killed Marines in 2003 in Iraq. And I mention that story because it prepared me well for government in that things, my background's in academia, but in government, it's very fluid. Things are always changing. The battle's always changing. And so you have to be very malleable. And I think when you're talking about meeting constituents where they are and understanding, listening to that last panel, you can't always just explain why the Senate solution or the House version or the piece of legislation is going to impact positively someone's life, but really being able to have a good conversation about how that is and how it plays out and building that trust. And so the previous panel, recognizing that they build so much trust in their communities, is really one of the key pieces.
Thanks so much, Julie and Ellen, for the invitation to participate in this. I'm so excited. I was like, hey, boss, I'm going to go do a Flag Day convening. And she was like, absolutely go do that. So it's great to be here and great to be with all of you. I'm sorry I missed some of the conversation from the last panel, but I also just want to acknowledge up front, like Julie mentioned, I am not a veteran. I have never served in uniform, but am very proud to support a U.S. Air Force musician who does serve in uniform. It is his dream to be a musician. It is his family's legacy, the Air Force bands in particular. And so, yeah, it's just a really unique opportunity for him to get to serve. Again, as Julie mentioned in my bio, I came to the military community a little bit backwards. I actually started with my public service. So I took my oath of service for my Senate job on May 15th, 2012. And I remember that day very clearly because I wasn't expecting to take that oath. But I go to the Senate dispersing office to enroll my direct deposit pay. Yes, I finally have a job. I'm 22 years old. I'm no longer unemployed. I'm going to go work for the Senate. And they tell me, okay, we're going to administer your oath of service. And I remember being in complete shock at the immense responsibility that all of a sudden became very clear to me. And it wasn't just for Arkansas constituents or Colorado constituents. It's really the responsibility of making decisions that are going to benefit the nation as a whole. So that's never been lost on me, that's not just an opportunity where you're supporting a singular member of Congress, but the decisions that you make every single day really are going to have a national and global impact for the United States. And so now that I'm a director at the Dion Company and working on some consulting, I bridge my two worlds together, now that I'm an active duty military spouse, by helping military families understand how to best advocate for the things that they care about and share their lived experiences with the decision makers in Congress who obviously need to hear from them about those lived experiences in order to make the most effective and best decisions in order to support our military families. I think now more than ever, you have military families really paying attention to what Congress is doing on military quality of life. And just a fun fact that maybe we can touch on a bit later too is the fact that we actually don't have a federal definition for military quality of life. So we talk about it a lot. We throw the term around a lot. I think everyone generally agrees that military quality of life is a good thing, but we don't have a federal definition for that. Each military department has their own, elements of what they would consider as important pieces of their quality of life. So thanks again for having me, and I'm just really looking forward to having these conversations.
Thank you, Julie. I'm going to go a long way around to answer your question. So I graduated, as Julie said, from the Air Force Academy, became an air rescue helicopter pilot, and I did that in Greenland and Alaska for 5 years. And then I was one of maybe a handful in the Air Force that transitioned from helicopters to fighters. And so I flew fighters for the rest of my career, F-4s, F-16s, F-111s. I had 2 staff jobs. I was General Schwarzkopf's personal briefer for 2 years before and during Desert Storm. I was on the first airplane that landed in Riyadh, and then served through the duration. And then finished up on the Joint Chiefs. I was the Africa Branch Chief. Wesley Clark was my immediate boss, and did strategic plans and policy. Entertained becoming a Beltway bandit for about an hour when I retired out of the Pentagon, and went into nonprofits, worked at the American Red Cross, Wounded Warrior Project, Mental Health America, and then got elected in 2015. I sit on a board of 9 county supervisors in Loudoun County, which is about, if you land at Dulles Airport, you're in Loudoun County, about 40 miles northwest. And I am also, at present, I've been in office about 6 years. I'm running for national second vice president of the National Association of Counties. Elections in July. You only run once. If you stay in office at your local area, then you step up to first vice president a year later and then national president a year after that. And the reason I bring that up is because in an audience back at our legislative conference in February, somebody said, "Why are you doing this? Why are you running for a second VP?" And I thought about it, and I didn't have a pat answer, and I have since developed an answer that I think is the right answer. I have been in public service since I was 17 years old. Every single day since I was 17 years old. I'm not going to tell you how old I am, but it's a long time to be in public service. And I think the really interesting part, so I was an air rescue pilot and a fighter pilot, and I worked in nonprofits as a fundraiser. This job as a county supervisor right now is the best job, hands down, I have ever had. It gives me a deep sense of satisfaction every day. You get up every day and you're hit with impossible problems with no preparation that you have to solve, that your constituents want you to solve. And it's about serving. And I think that's why military people are drawn to this kind of life. It's because we have an innate sense of service to others. That's who we are. And how does it help in local politics or not local service, local public service? I go into every problem with a pretty clearly defined sense of what's right and what's wrong. And I think that I can't decide whether that's what drew me to the military or that's what the military gave me. One or the other, doesn't really matter. But I think when you wear a uniform and you commit to a life of military service or being in a family of military members, you are committing to service and you are committing to, I have a pretty good sense in my own mind of what's right and what's wrong. And to take that into the public sphere in elected office is really helpful, and I think my constituents can smell that a mile away. They can smell authenticity a mile away. They may not agree with the decision you make, but they know that you're going to make a decision based on what you think is right and wrong. And to have that sort of clarity in a really not clear profession like politics is, I think, a breath of fresh air for a lot of people.
I think that resonates. Before we move on, I have to ask you, though, I'm a helicopter pilot. Was it better to fly helicopters or fighters?
I can't possibly answer that.
I think you could.
Okay. People ask me what was best, and I said, well, it depends. The most satisfying mission was air rescue.
Yep.
The most fun to fly was the F-16.
Okay.
The best bomber and most accurate bomber was the F-111, but my heart will forever be with the F-4 because you really had to know what you were doing in the F-4. So depends on the context.
Flown a lot of aircraft. And then I wanted to push back just slightly on something you said, Heba. It bothers me when people say they are not a veteran, they are just a spouse or something like that. I'm a veteran, I'm also a Navy spouse, and it is harder to be the one at home than the one on deployment. I can decidedly say that. So thank you, truly, for being a service member spouse.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that. I feel a tremendous sense of duty and responsibility to serve in this way. I am challenged personally, and I'll let you all in on this because we're all friends now. In the military spouse community specifically, we really struggle with this idea of us serving, right? Because a lot of it's volunteerism. You are choosing to participate and to be a part of the community if you are volunteering and connecting with the community in that way. So many of us are FRG leaders, we're ombudsmen, we're key support liaisons, whatever the family readiness group leader it is that you're doing. But we really struggle with that because we never want it to come off as though we are equating our volunteerism as somehow, similar or even remotely. But yes, it is deeply personal, and I'm more than honored and proud to have the opportunity to do it. So thank you, I appreciate it.
Yeah, it is a public service. Okay, so moving to a slightly different topic, you have had to work, we don't have all parties represented here, we have different parties. You've had to work with members of different parties. Were there moments when your identity, either as a veteran or as a spouse, kind of shone through in your ability to find common ground? And not just like on something that was a little bit, it's something that you fundamentally disagreed with, but you had to serve your people. How did that show up, your status as a veteran working for the mission and the experience you had either in or with the military to help solve the problem? What does that look like when you're working through policy making?
Well, I used to say when I first got elected on city council, and it stuck with me even serving as Senate president, that in the Marine Corps, and especially in Iraq in 2003, no one to the left or the right of you mattered if it was a Democrat or Republican or an unaffiliate. It was about getting the mission accomplished. It was about working together as a team and believing in the mission. And that perspective stayed with me and continues to stay with me today. And I think of when, I was a minority leader, so obviously didn't always serve in the majority. I later became a Senate president and helped earn a majority. But with that perspective of saying that, You know, I've always wanted to work with anyone who is ready, willing, and able to roll up their sleeves and in a very Colorado-like manner say, let's get the job done. And when I was in the House and as a new member of the House of Representatives, there was a senator named Owen Hill, who's a Republican from Colorado Springs, Air Force Academy graduate. My son's an Air Force Academy graduate. Obviously, as a Marine, veterans have a lot of respect for other veterans and their family members. And so I'd go over to the Senate and visit Senator Hill, and while we didn't always agree, almost never agreed on the policy perspective or the approach to the policy perspective, we would go to dinner. We would enjoy each other's company. We would talk about our kids. We would talk about our families. He only lived 30 minutes north of me in Colorado Springs. I lived in Pueblo. And so I think that kind of attitude and perspective goes a long way. It doesn't matter if you're in the military, it doesn't matter if you're in public service or as an elected official. Matter of fact, I saw a lot of people at the Pentagon sometimes who didn't have that perspective while I served there as an appointee. And I think it impacted the mission in a negative way. And so the willingness to always want to be collaborative, well, we know that doesn't always work, is in my perspective, the best approach.
I'll say there are probably only a few times where I felt that I was maybe, there was like a question on the table. I'll give an example. Several years ago, I was still working for Senator Bozeman, and there was the ban, the travel ban, you know, overseas. I'm the very proud eldest daughter of immigrants from Egypt, both naturalized. I was actually at my mother's naturalization ceremony. Had no idea what I was witnessing, but appreciate it much more so now. And I covered the immigration portfolio, of course. And I had to go to my boss and just say, hey, look, I get that this is gonna be whatever this is gonna be. I'm not trying to tell you that you need to publicly go out and say anything one way or the other, you know, in defense of me as a person, but this is really challenging for me. This one is gonna be really hard, and I just want you to know where I am. And I think the fact that we are able to do that with some level of respect, just to say that, hey, I'm not saying that I'm, you know, want to go fight. I don't want to go to the mat. I don't want to have a fight about it. I just want you to know where I am, and I want you to appreciate. But that level of shared respect really is a two-way street, and it's just about knowing, like, hey, I'm going to choose my battles here. This is one to go, you know, this is one to go for, and this is one not to go for. But thankfully, I worked for two very, very respectable members of the United States Senate. I was very fortunate. Wasn't ever put in a situation where I felt that it, you know, was a question of my own personal ethics or integrity. So I'm very lucky for that.
We have a 9-person board of supervisors in Loudoun County. We have 6 Democrats, 2 Republicans, and a crazy person. Our political spectrum runs all the way from the far left to the far right. The vast majority of our decisions, and I would say probably more than 85 to 90% of our decisions, are unanimous or bipartisan. We approach, this happens a lot at the county level. Our principal function is land use, primarily in taxation. You go at a problem and your first question around the table is, what are we trying to do? What's the mission? What are we trying to solve here? I realized when I first ran for office, I've kind of got a decision-making hierarchy. So if I'm looking at a position or a potential solution to a problem, the first question I ask, does it violate my core values? I won't do that. Next level down, does it actually solve the problem? If it does, then next level down is, what do my constituents want me to do? And then the fourth level is, what does my party want me to do, my political party? I've never gotten to number 4 in 6.5 years. It just is not relevant at county level government. You're trying to solve a problem for your constituents. The real rub comes, yes, it will solve the problem, and my constituents hate that answer. That gets really difficult, because now it's my job, if I think this is going to solve the problem, to go out and sell that to my constituents and take the risk. The chair of the county, chair at large, Phyllis Randall, who is an amazing leader and the first person of color ever to run a Virginia county. One of her favorite sayings is, if you going to be a really effective elected leader, you have to be willing to be an unelected leader. And that's true. And I mean, right now, I was reading, we've got a public hearing tonight, and I was reading the agenda for the public hearing. There's a couple of things on the public hearing right now which are really contentious. A couple hundred people will show up, and they're not going to be happy no matter what you say or do. So I think you just have to be mission focused. What are we trying to accomplish here? In NACO as a committee chair, we have policy discussions all the time. Not a single time since I've been a NACO committee chair, and it's completely mixed bag politically. Not one time have I heard anybody in those discussions say, wait, are you a Democrat or a Republican? Never come up. Everybody's focused on what do we have to do to solve the problem.
Yeah, I think that when that shines through, and I'm just thinking, I live in the next county over, Fairfax County. Loudoun County isn't often in the news, and it's probably because you're doing a really good job governing, right?
Okay, I'll take that.
When people escalate in a way that is not helpful, that's when we often find ourselves in the news, right? So we're talking a lot about how our veteran status lends us credibility. It has all these amazing qualities where we're able to work together and solve problems. I was on a call several months ago with one of the service-to-service fellows, and she's a veteran, or she might still be active. She goes to UC Berkeley. And her question for our guest speaker was, well, what happens when you're afraid that your veteran status is not going to necessarily reflect well on either the population you're serving, or, if people have certain stereotypes, kind of Ellen had mentioned, everyone thinks you're a baby killer, and you're trying to fight back against that, or has that ever happened? Do you have any advice for necessarily fighting back against that, or necessarily leaning in a way that sort of teaches people that veterans are not a monolith?
For me, I don't know that question really applies at that level, and here's why. I come from Pueblo, Colorado. It's a home of the heroes, 5 Congressional Medal of Honor recipients. I'm the long line of military service in our family. As I said, my oldest son's a graduate of the Air Force Academy. Both my younger brothers followed in my footsteps and joined the Marine Corps as well, and served in Iraq and Afghanistan. So for me, it was almost the exact opposite, and we didn't talk about maybe combat operations because, fortunately for me, my role was the receiving side of that, to make sure that those deceased members got home to their families and that their safeguards were taken care of. And so it was that full American, if you will, like picture. But I will say, I've also leaned into public service in general. Not everyone has to be a member of the armed forces. I spent 20 plus years as a paramedic, worked alongside firefighters, first responders, others, elected officials. I mean, we all know when you serve, if you have that servant-like attitude, servant leadership, it applies in any aspect. And so, while I'm particularly proud of my military service and being a veteran and serving, of course, Marines have a little bit of an ego, being in the Marine Corps. I think my message is always for finding people who want to just serve, and even if that's in any capacity, poll watching or doing those kinds of things that are really part of our civic responsibility as Americans.
So it's interesting because I didn't come to have a military spouse identity until I was 29 years old, and at that point I was already, financially independent, working on my own, had this, professional career on Capitol Hill, worked on a lot of really cool stuff. And so it was actually a bit of a transition for me, and it still is, because depending on who you're talking with, sometimes you say, oh, well, if you lead that I'm a military spouse, they may just assume that you don't have any ambition professionally, or that you're glad to be a homemaker, or that maybe you don't necessarily have that experience or expertise. I realize that it's rare, but I will tell you all a story. I was teaching at a squadron command course for a handful of the spouses that were participating, and a spouse came up to me after the conversation and just said, hey, Heba, thanks so much for sharing about your congressional background and kind of what you got to do on Capitol Hill and are still doing as far as advocacy. I just want you to know I'm an engineer on the F-35 program. Holy cow. I thought that was so cool. I was like, I want to go shout that from the rooftops. How awesome is that? We have a military spouse who's an engineer, okay, not an administrative assistant, an engineer on the F-35 program. That's pretty stinking cool. So I think, though, that the thing that's really unique is that we tend to, even though military spouses don't have any identifier patches and, we don't have any like t-shirts like, hey, I'm a military spouse, come talk to me. We tend to gravitate toward one another. Same thing with veterans and service members. It's almost like it's like a weird shared camaraderie thing. It's like, hey, game, recognize game. Like, I see you, and I recognize you. So we tend to just gravitate toward each other.
And will you be my emergency contact?
Yes, exactly. Absolutely. Yes, I did that with our dog. So, but there is like this just shared, I think, recognition and almost an immediate inherent connection when you are in the presence of service members, veterans, and military families. And it's still a little bit up in the air. There are some folks that obviously have perceptions about military spouses and our service or our professional, careers and ambitions. But I've become pretty proud of getting to share that with folks and love getting to see their reaction when they learn that I worked on Capitol Hill for so long. So it's always a fun time.
I've never encountered any sort of innate bias because of my military background. Never once have I encountered that. Now, one of the cool things at the county level is I share a real affinity with our first responders because I was one. So right away, I've got an in with the firefighters and I've got an in with the police officers, and so that creates a community, and that community writ large is very, very respected in our county, in Loudoun County, and I think that's pretty true. It's been fun to watch the evolution of the military spouse world since I was in. When I was an ops officer in F-111s in New Mexico, I was newly married to my second wife, and so we went there, and we were having a debate because the Air Force opinion was that military spouses should not work at all. They should be at home all the time. And we had a military spouse in our squadron who was a lawyer, and I didn't subscribe to you got to be at home all the time. And it was just changing. So the conversations that we were having were, is this really right? Should we really pigeonhole this? And of course, women were in combat at that point. So that has evolved since then. I had a conversation one time, I remember it vividly. We were flying in the H-3 up in Alaska. And I was a co-pilot seat that day. And my pilot and I, Don Hadley, a good friend of mine, we got into a conversation about women in combat. And he looked at me and he said, and we were air rescue. This was just after Vietnam. He looked at me and said, okay, so you've been shot down, you're in the jungle in Vietnam, and all of a sudden the helicopter comes over and they drop the hoist down, and you're riding the hoist up to the helicopter, and you look up and you see the pilot of the helicopter is a woman. How would you feel? And I looked at him and I said, pretty damn good. I couldn't even believe he asked the question. The mechanic, the lead mechanic on one of our helicopters, a woman named Colleen, she was fantastic. She was universally respected. And she would move 200-pound rotor blades just like nobody's business. I mean, she did the job. And I've been an adherent, and I think for the most part, if you have a military background, I get the impression from military families today that it really is about doing the job. It kind of doesn't matter what gender you are, frankly, what sexual preference you have or sexual orientation you have. Do the job. If you do the job, you're going to be respected by your peers. That's it. And I think that permeates military families too. Everybody has respect for people who serve. You do your job and they'll respect you.
At my squadron, there was one other woman pilot who overlapped at the same time, and another officer legit looked at me one time and was like, "Are you guys allowed to fly together?" Yeah, like, of course we're allowed to fly together. Like, people still ask. All right, I could go on about spouses and women in the military all day. We're gonna wrap it up with our last question. We had a fantastic guest last night speak to our fellows, Jimmy Anderson, who's the Deputy Director of the VA Veterans and Military Engagement for the state of Maryland. And he made the point that we're kind of federal, not just federal, but government in general is at a bit of a crisis right now as far as people's trust, not just in the federal government. I think it's probably at a lesser level at the state and local government, but people are really cynical about both any party that they represent are cynical about the role that government plays. We're here for Flag Day. Ellen mentioned, this is a time for everyone to sort of celebrate this symbol of unity, of patriotism. What would you like Americans to understand about why public service at every level still really critically matters in their lives? And what do you wish that more Americans knew about what you did when you were serving at the federal and state level, and what you currently do, Supervisor Turner, in your position?
Well, I'll say that I think, sometimes we can see at the nation's capital some of that division on the Hill, that I do truly believe it is true when you get into local levels and you look at the legislatures. I was former president of NCSL, National Conference of State Legislators, which is bipartisan, so they represent all legislators in multiple states. And as you look at those state houses, that really, it can be less divisive. And really, it's incumbent on the leaders to really set that tone. And it's important on whether or not that's a city council or a county commission. But I think really to hear people out and respect, I love what the previous panel was talking about, like whether or not someone was going to absorb what the rational process was through election process, but at least hearing them out and approaching it that way. And I think using the American flag and our values as Americans to come together is something we really believe in, is something very, very clear in the West. In Colorado, there is always this effort of we roll up our sleeves and work together. And so I think when we can really ask that of people to refer to the common good and really focus on that, and I think in the appropriate way, for me, when I think of the flag, I many times think of the process of the retrieval process and processing of Marines and getting back to Dover Air Force Base, but then seeing that on the receiving end. And unfortunately, several times I was part of those ceremonies where you'd present the flag on behalf of our nation. I think reminding people of that common good and the spirit that we all share is something that is essential. And as Jimmy Anderson and I have talked over the years, I think we have to appeal to that in people, because that not only wins, that is our true American winning spirit for us to be collaborative and together. So that would be my hope.
Yeah, it's interesting. As I was just kind of prepping for this panel a bit, I started asking people around me, my parents, my sister, friends, my husband, hey, what does the flag mean to you? Like, what does that represent to you? Because it means something maybe a little bit different for everyone, right? We all know the technical specs of it and those representations, but what does it actually mean to you? And I'm thinking, for myself, it's always meant promise, like just the promise that's out there, but also the promises that we make as citizens, as active citizens, as engaged and informed ones. That promise is for all those that made that ultimate sacrifice on behalf of our nation and service to our nation. It's for all those that are currently serving. It's for all those that have served to protect and defend this country. And it's not just the military's responsibility to protect our democracy. It's our responsibility to protect our democracy. All of us at every level. Leadership is not a rank, and leadership is not a role. And if you're waiting for someone to tell you, okay, we're going to make you a leader now, that's not it. So I think, to me, as I think about making good and holding true to the promises that we have made to those that serve on our nation's behalf, but also to the promise of our country for the future, I would want the American public to understand that they play a role in this process. And it's going to take every single one of us to be wildly and catastrophically successful on behalf of our country in order to ensure that the nation that we hand over to the next generation of citizens and residents, that they can have the same opportunities to go after whatever it is that they choose to do. That is the representation for me. So I would hope that we could start to bring people into that conversation more. It's not just for our military to protect our country. It's for all of us to play a role in protecting our nation. And that means being active and being engaged and being informed. We're all learning. We can learn something new every day, but we all have a small role to play. And it doesn't have to be anything grandiose, but certainly paying attention is a really good start.
I think the challenge is to communicate to everybody you come in contact with. I believe people are inherently decent. If they're living in this country under this flag, then they are inherently decent. So what does that mean? I used to teach the Dale Carnegie course, and there was one of the things we taught people is in a conversation, get the other person saying yes, yes immediately. What that means is find common ground. Right at the top of the conversation, find common ground that you can share. Everybody generally understands it's wrong to lie. It's wrong to steal. It's wrong to hurt people. It's wrong to spread hate. Everybody generally understands that. And so I really try and focus, well, there's two levels. The first level is I got to live that way. Again, my constituents will smell inauthenticity a mile away. So if I'm saying, oh, you should be nice, and I'm not nice, they're going to see through that. You got to have integrity. And so you have to walk the walk, but then you have to work on the assumption that everybody around you fundamentally knows that lying is wrong, that stealing is wrong, that hurting people is wrong, that discriminating is wrong, and try and cut through the noise. One of the things that's most disturbing to me today that I've never encountered in my life in this country is the noise from those who don't believe those basics is so loud and so pervasive that the hatred is now starting to be passed off as the truth. The lies are starting to be passed off as the truth. And that scares me to death because that's sort of a groupthink thing going on that really bothers me a lot. It makes people forget, no, it's wrong to call somebody a name. It's just wrong. You shouldn't do it. I don't care what position you're in. And so we've got to walk the walk. We've got to live what we think we should be in America. We've got to aspire to the highest meaning of our flag every day in the way we live our lives. But then somehow when we talk to people, when we act with people, and especially when we do our jobs, we've got to do our jobs with those kinds of basics. I get some pretty nasty emails on a fairly regular basis as a county supervisor. I know what I want to say when I send the email back, and I will get up and walk away from the computer and take a deep breath and then come back in a respectful way because I don't know what that person's situation is on the other end. But we've got to practice that more and more. And I will just say, I'm uncomfortable when I see the flag being used for some other reason. So if I see, the black and white flag that has the blue stripe in the center and various permutations, that it really bothers me. The flag is the flag. It stands for a core set of values as Americans that we believe and as a country we believe. And you don't mess around with that. And I can name half a dozen friends of mine that died in the service of that flag. And so I don't want anybody screwing around with it. But I think we each have to dig down individually and say, I can't control all the hate and all the fear and all the bigotry that's going on in our society right now, but I can control how I behave, and I can control how I interact with others. And if nothing else, I can set an example of what that flag stands for.
Well, thank you very much. I think we can all sort of agree the values-driven leadership that all of you have lived by and that all of you are showing are a really excellent representative of the flag and what Flag Day means. So let's give a round of applause for our panelists.
That's a wrap on this conversation. Thank you to our panelists for showing up, speaking openly, and reminding us why this work matters. If this resonated with you, subscribe to Vetted Conversations wherever you get your podcasts and pass it along to someone who needs to hear it. To learn more about We the Veterans and military families, head to wetheveterans.us. We'll see you on the next one.